Thank you for your patience, everyone. We usually start things here at Berkeley at Berkeley time, which is 10 minutes after. So hence the starting at 12:10. Good afternoon. I am Carolyn Chen, co-director of the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. And I want to welcome you to our final talk of the Public Forum on Race, Religion, Democracy, and the American Dream. And today we've saved the best for last. I'm so honored today to introduce our special speaker, Dr. Jason Sexton, who will be speaking on Reconceiving Christianity and the Modern Prison, on evangelicalism's eugenic logic and mass incarceration. Dr. Sexton is a theologian based at UCLA's Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, and teaches in UCLA's Sociology department, with interest in California, carcerality, religion, theology, and the environment. He studies how the cultural and theological norms of communities show up in social and ethical action. Dr. Sexton is the author of The Trinitarian Theology of Stanley J. Grenz and the editor of the forthcoming Redemptive Dreams, Engaging Kevin Starr's California, which will be coming out this year. He has written extensively in academic journals such as Ecclesial Practices and Political Theology, as well as public outlets such as the LA Times and the LA Review of Books. He served as the president of the American Academy of Religion Western Region and as editor of UC Press's press-published Boom, California. Now, before I turn the floor over to Dr. Sexton, I want to give a shout out to Patty Dunlap, Beck Sussman, and Victoria Jashev for helping to organize this event. And I also want to express my gratitude to the Henry Luce Foundation for making this event possible. Now, will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Jason Sexton?
Thanks so much, Carolyn. Wow, best for, I think now that we've heard from you, it's all sort of downhill, I think. I'm so honored to be here on this lunchtime talk and part of this series. I love what the Berkeley Center for Study of Religion has been doing. I've been a fan and a participant from the Public Theology Initiative from 2016 to 19 to now this, and I'm such a huge fan from down here in LA and UCLA. And so just delighted to participate in this and share some of my research with you. That said, I think we'll just begin. I'll go ahead and share my screen for the time we have. If everyone can see that, then I think we're in good shape. Can everybody see that? Okay, great. So the title of the talk, Reconceiving Christianity in the Modern Prison. My research has been focused on sort of the intersectional space between theology and carcerality, as Dr. Chen has mentioned, and continuing some of where it's led is brought me into this conversation about eugenics. And I'll sort of give you some background first, but I think we need to start by really introducing the concept of eugenics to show how I've been seeking to really relocate the eugenics conversation. Now, in the aftermath of World War II, I think you all know the history, eugenics and the pseudoscientific base used to justify eugenic practices are generally understood to have phased off the scene. As the common understanding goes, and has gone, the modern civilized world has no place for scientific research or ethical practices that reflect the ideas used by the Third Reich, by German Nazis, to systematically exterminate gypsies, homosexuals, disabled persons, Jewish persons, and others. The Nuremberg trials that immediately followed the war and the rejection of scientific knowledge gained through violent experiments precipitated the rejection of eugenics. And following that Nuremberg trials, the two UNESCO statements, United Nations, on race in 1950 and 51 built on that momentum to settle the matter globally. Both, as it went, social and natural scientists came to broadly agree that theories about hereditary differences that were based on races that animated Nazi ideology were untenable, based on faulty science. eugenics philosophy and policy became then not only unattractive, but were deemed evil. And yet all this occurred after eugenics had long dominated earlier conversations about the future of humanity, both in academic and public circles. The earlier 20th century eugenics movement had been committed to describing their research subjects in terms of so-called negative and positive aspects, negative eugenics and positive eugenics. It can be defined in context as an international effort to use science and medicine to justify limiting the reproduction and existence of individuals deemed to be of an inferior racial stock while promoting the reproduction of those thought to be racially superior. And this is a gloss definition from Osagie Obasagi, a colleague at UC Berkeley. With post-war discussions about so-called positive or negative eugenics being squelched then, by the 1960s, eugenics seemed to totally disappear. Yet upon closer examination, research today, whether in newly defined fields like biogenetics or bioethics, or in fields designated as new genetics or even new eugenics, some call it, this research concludes today that regardless of how marginal it may have been, eugenics more correctly waxed and waned than actually disappeared. Newer revelations give the extended story, demonstrating that eugenics research and eugenics practices have been very much ongoing. Eugenics has endured not only in the popular public imagination, which some scholars believe has played a major role in maintaining the myth of innate racial differences, but has also continued quietly in academic circles and covertly in governmental institutional practices. It's beyond what's found today in purportedly positive eugenics efforts like, say, the Human Genome Project, with its relevant theological problems, which I discuss in my article. I should mention that this article, I won't be able to go through it. I mean, I'm effectively walking through the content of an article that was just accepted this weekend in the Journal of Law and Religion, but not to be published until May 2024. So it's a long queue, and if anybody's interested in seeing the paper, I'd be happy to share it if you send me an email. But this all has led with this conversation to a question for me in my research, and the question about whether mass incarceration is rooted in and intertwined with eugenic philosophy. And if so, does it advance with a latter 20th century rationale that incorporated the religious and theological with the pseudoscientific? Now this manner of questioning develops the hypothesis that popular post-World War II assumptions about race, which trickled into criminal justice policy, were fueled by ongoing trust in a eugenic philosophy similar to what existed in the pre-war period. So there's continuity from pre-war to post-war on this matter of eugenic thinking. Now, this also, I think, leads to another sort of final reflection, and it has to do with the matter of where were particular theological emphases that were intertwined with eugenic and theological logics that are then found in inherited in ideological institution building practices, especially as they might be found within post-war American evangelicalism during its rise to prominence within American and global Christianity. Now, the inquiry carries distinct relevance, especially if the penitentiary is understood, the modern prison that is, in light of its genealogical and conceptual roots, is substantially a theological construct rather than a mere secular entity, that it's an apparatus and an artifact that we've inherited from theological logic, which I both assume as well as argue in the paper that is so. Now, to take this to sort of the next level, at least for the development of my argument, there have been many scholars who've worked on both pre and post-World War II historical phenomena dealing with eugenics. I think of historian Miroslava Chavez Garcia at UC Santa Barbara. I think of our Dean of Humanities at UCLA, Alexandra Stern, and the various work. And we don't have time to get into that and that research, although I do in the paper. Of course, our colleague Osagie Obasagi, who we've already mentioned at Berkeley, has done some of this work, both at the scholarly and popular public level, with his recent, I guess a year ago or so now, maybe two now, article in the LA Times citing a eugenics fund at UC Berkeley that continued to be used. So there's a longer conversation happening, but for my research and for this project here, a trenchant interrogation of contemporary eugenic philosophy comes from the legal scholar Laura Appelman, who has been really relentless in her steady analysis of what she calls the long tail of eugenics. The long tail of eugenics, which for her is a conceptual tool used to help explain recent incarceration policies. She argues that policies that generated our nationwide system, right, in this country, the United States, a nationwide system of segregation and punitive detention arose from attitudes about eugenics, class, and disability. And with her careful historical analytic work of Europe and the US, including asylum growth, she notes that from the very beginning of America's founding as a nation, the treatment of the disabled was designed to quarantine away those individuals who were seen as irredeemable members of the polity. As she goes on in this work, drawing from other historians to note how these sets of beliefs reflect or show up as both reflexive and deeply ingrained habits that expose a thin line between racial and class-based eugenics practices that built our current unprecedented moment of mass incarceration. And she concludes, quote, "Our desire to control those individuals who violate our societal norms, whether through crime, disability, mental illness, or poverty, has led us time and time again to tactics of imprisonment, coercive medical procedures, and institutionalization. The ties between institutionalization, eugenics, and social engineering have led to the imprisonment of a significant percentage of our population for remarkably similar reasons as we did in the 19th and 20th centuries. We simply do so in different types of carceral institutions." Now, building directly on Laura Appelman's efforts, American carceral governance scholar Jonathan Simon, dear friend and mentor figure to me, details how the express pre-commitment of progressive era Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Cardozo yielded a eugenic view of law and crime policy that resulted in what Jonathan calls a judicial realism that began to govern criminal legal matters in characteristically eugenic ways. Simon defines that this realism is expressed through the honing in on the dangerous minority, for whom redemption and reform is either impossible or at least unlikely in the system, with weak law enforcement constituting the cultural weak link of the criminal system, and where punishment began to focus on the criminal instead of crime. And I mention these legal scholars because they're massively significant for my argument. Several articles, and Laura Appelman has produced several more than Jonathan on this subject, although Jonathan connecting Cardozo's decision to one recently reflected in a decision from Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts, appropriating Cardozo directly in a case having to do with crime. So I depend then on this work from these legal scholars where punishment begins to focus on the criminal rather than the crime in the shape of what Simon is referring to as a judicial realism. But for my work, I'm as a scholar of religion, wanting to say, okay, if this eugenic logic is operative in penal policy in the United States, what role is religion playing here? And I would leave it to other scholars to take a look at other traditions, but I want to take some responsibility for the tradition I work directly with, Christianity, and try to understand what's happening here in the 20th century, especially within evangelicalism, of course, as you know, being the title of this paper. But I have to start somewhere before this, and we'll start with the situation at Princeton Seminary between what I call science and racial fundamentalism. Now, there's a controversy that happened at Princeton Seminary among two figures who are generally understood to represent major tributaries into 20th century evangelicalism. And the two figures that I identify are B.B. Warfield, Professor B.B. Warfield, and J. Gresham Machen, who was his junior colleague. They were both deemed stalwarts among Reformed Protestant evangelicals today, as well as those drawing from more fundamentalist notions of evangelicalism. And a dispute among them with reference to eugenic thinking, penality, and the discussion at hand focused on race. Raised in the South, southern part of the United States, Professor Warfield had been a staunch himself opponent of racism, referring to it as the spirit of caste, operating in what he called a wicked caste society. He saw racism as inconsistent with the unity of the human race created in Adam, in God's image, and the unifying entailments of the gospel of Christ, he called it. With his positions firmly established in light of the growing eugenic sentiments behind the scientific thinking of his day, his explicit position against polygenism, that is, that humans descended from different origin spaces, right? This conceptual tool that was used at the time for parsing out races. His opposition toward polygenism was uncompromising. Historians Mark Knoll and David Livingstone point out that for Warfield, both science and scripture taught the organic solidarity of all human stock. They summarize B.B. Warfield's position in this way, quote, "The racist undercurrents in much of the era's polygenic polemic, which imply that humankind comprised several distinct biological species, Warfield unhesitatingly attributed to an ugly, if deep-seated, racial pride." Warfield's position becomes critically important in light of the sentiments of his junior colleague, Machen, who we present a picture of here. And Machen's efforts to vehemently oppose Warfield's efforts to integrate Princeton Seminary's dorm rooms. Recent archival discoveries by an editor, magazine editor, and on social media, where these have been published, deep in the archives at Princeton. Timothy Isaiah Cho has revealed that in a letter dated October 5th, 1913, Machen writes in a letter to his mother of being, quote, "intensely angry to hear people talking intelligibly about equal civil rights of Negroes," which on his account meant that in the South, white men would be unsafe and without governmental protection. Claiming to have support for the entire faculty in opposition to Warfield's integration efforts, Machen asserted that Warfield's views, which he elsewhere calls Black republicanism, are bitterly lacking in appreciation of the facts, he calls them, of human nature. Machen's rejection then of integrationism and of the integration of this one particular student, a quote, colored man, into the student dorms with the rest of the students. This needs to be understood, I think, in light of the subsequent development of Machen's fundamentalist ideology and its reductionist theological anthropology that was not so much anti-science as it was thoroughly forged in opposition to liberal modernism. And we don't have too much time to discuss this now. We could, of course, in the Q&A if anybody would like to. But what this meant was that Machen's opposition to what he called, again, modernism did amount to a distrust of science, that he did accept a modest form of biological evolution, although not from earlier forms of life, which D.G. Hart suggests show a hesitancy that reveals sympathy with fundamentalist hostility toward evolution. But his selective approach still supported the foregone conclusion of his own deep-seated ignorant racism, which is grounded in a foregone conclusion that generated a cognitive dissonance for him toward other supposed facts of science, as well as toward Warfield's anti-polygenic argument. Now, not getting too much in the weeds here, it's important to note that I think Warfield's theological anthropology, on the other hand, did reflect a careful attention to science, but also toward a more traditional Calvinist view, not only with regard to the unity of all human stock, hence anti-racist, but also with such outlooks on matter of human disability and criminality. And I do go into this somewhat in the paper. But moving on, because I think this is a helpful conversation in the backdrop of what we get in the post-war period, noting Machen's anti-modernism and so on. But then you have Christian people who are engaged in these questions of science and faith in ways that create several different groupings. Now, when considering how this worked throughout the wider Christian world, based on different inherited logics of the time, that had sometimes engagement with eugenics per se, other times not so much. Modernist liberal Protestants were largely found to embrace eugenics, and so did a number of Catholics. Folks are often surprised to note. The most prominent figure to join the American Eugenics Society in the early 20th century being Father John A. Ryan, later becoming Monsignor Ryan, who was an advisor to Franklin Roosevelt. Now Ryan, and there was one other Catholic that joined the American Eugenics Society, Father John Cooper. They actually didn't stay long. They embraced the eugenics movement in this sense briefly, but left it in 1930 over eugenicists' support of compulsory sterilization, birth control, and the liberalization of divorce laws. And then by the 1930s, the American Catholic retreat from eugenics was totally complete. Together with Father John Ryan and this departure, there were, of course, several other Catholic figures such as Dorothy Day and the British writer G.K. Chesterton, who would also strongly opposed eugenics. And yet, of course, there are other Catholic figures on the wider global scene, perhaps most notably Adolf Hitler, who had, of course, embraced eugenics, in this case under the Third Reich, with really the first attack in Germany on bad genes, coming with the sterilization programs that were legalized in 1933 with a particular law called the Law for the Prevention of Genetically Ill Progeny. Now, amounting to outright warfare against society's most weak and vulnerable, Hitler's practices mimicked those in the United States, which has been well documented, especially in California. And yet, in light of what we have with Protestants and a couple Catholic figures, we have, with what's happening in Germany, a Lutheran pastor, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who responds to the situation in 1933, this law for the prevention of genetically ill progeny, responds in 1934 with a sermon. And he gives the sermon at St. Paul's Church in London, taking his text as one verse where the Lord tells the Apostle Paul, "My strength is made perfect in weakness." Now, Bonhoeffer preaches this sermon in London as an attempt to reflect on the mystery of poor people and ill people and what he called insane people who need to rely on others for help, for love, and for care. Among those, he considers the dilemma of the lacking hope with the crippled, with the socially exploited, with what he calls, quote, a colored man in a white country, and an untouchable, who he deemed all destined to perish, other, quote, an aristocratic philosophy of life which glorified strength and power and violence as the ultimate ideals of humanity. Bonhoeffer asserted that, in contradistinction, that Christianity stands or falls with its revolutionary protest against violence, arbitrariness, and pride of power, with its apologia for the weak, its defense of the weak. Bonhoeffer insisted that Christianity in the sermon had adjusted itself much too easily to the worship of power. It should, in turn, give much more offense, more shock to the world than it's doing. Christianity should take a much more definitive stand for the weak, that it consider the potential moral right of the strong, he said in the sermon. Then we also get the famous Swiss Protestant theologian Karl Barth, who had also rejected the German nationalist eugenics program, had to leave Germany amid this movement. And that eugenics program had classified the socially unproductive, you'll note, as Lebenswert, those who were productive as Leben, life, unworthy of life. To which Barth responded that all human life must be recognized as divine gift. And in this way, it's mysterious as well as deeply respected, since Barth said the worth of such life is God's secret. Now, with this happening in sort of the European scene, continental Europe in particular, what I find interesting is how these some of these logics are carried forward within post-war evangelicalism. Now, the best account of evangelicalism's post-war involvement in the development of American policies of crime control and punishment comes from the recent book by Aaron Griffith, published by Harvard in 2020, called God's Law and Order: The Politics of Punishment in Evangelical America. And Griffith, giving him a shout out for his incredible work, focused on critical points where evangelicals were complicit with the mass incarceration building project, and demonstrates that this included a large ignorance of how their efforts supported harsh criminal justice policies that in turn prevented any meaningful challenge to the systemic injustices of racial, social, and economic inequality that were at work in the United States. But absent in his investigation is any real interrogation of the eugenics practices and eugenic logic that had supposedly gone away with the presumed abandonment of eugenics after, right, Nazi adoption. You know, and of course, a simple explanation for that in Aaron's defense is, of course, you know, evangelicals and almost everyone in the post-war period just weren't using the term anymore, right? The term shifted, and we can see that happening in various institutions. And there's a lot of work, I think, that still needs to be done, perhaps in places like the Prison Fellowship archives and elsewhere, perhaps in Christianity Today archives and Wheaton College and places like that. But starting with what's happening within evangelicalism, I think it's important to highlight the number one figure, arguably, in the post-war American period, namely Billy Graham, and what I call his penal outlook. Now, Griffith helpfully demonstrates how these tough on crime policies were supported by evangelical individualism and notions of individual responsibility that were coupled with a healthy fear of Americans that were seen as increasingly wicked places, and yet from which individuals, even out of these wicked cities, could still be saved through the gospel message. As such, when crimes were committed, on Griffith's account, the ideal outcome for criminals was their conversion, not a court conviction per se. Accordingly, evangelical attitudes exemplified in the preeminent figure of the movement, Billy Graham, were of the harsh kind. For Graham, this meant the requirement of a tough preaching, not only of the law, and of course, in the sense of the biblical law, but with some overlap, not only a harsh preaching of the law, but also a harsh preaching of the gospel, that is for conversion. The quintessential style that Graham employed in his particular evangelistic efforts actually outraged theologian Karl Barth, who we had just introduced you to. When Karl Barth saw Billy Graham for himself in his 1962 US visit, leading Barth to this analysis, he says, in response to Graham's preaching, that was not the good news. That was pistol shooting. An urgent appeal was made to people. You must, you should. It was a proclamation of the law. He wanted to scare people. To threaten always makes an impression. People would always much rather be frightened than be made joyful. At a later press conference, after hearing Graham preach, Karl Barth reaffirmed his critique by stating the contrast. Christian faith begins with joy and not with fear. Mr. Graham begins by making people afraid. Now, the Santa Clara University-based theological ethicist Bryson White takes this one step further in his analysis of the deeply symbolic performative act of Billy Graham's corpse. Billy Graham, of course, now dead, but also lying in state in 2018 under the US Capitol Rotunda, where Graham's body is set within a wooden casket that was built by incarcerated people who have been based in the Louisiana State Penitentiary. Similar to a major thrust of Griffith's account, Bryson White observes that in his sermons, Graham had embraced and propagated law and order rhetoric, which served as a key contributor to the rise of mass incarceration. But that this law and order rhetoric was not only found in Graham's regular preaching efforts, which included preaching also to many incarcerated people during his life, but also while having their labor exploited at his death and through their outsider status. They're not invited to the Capitol Rotunda, right? Being made to craft national understandings of citizenship. White refers to Graham's message as what he calls Platonized nationalistic Christianity, including with a theology that lent legitimacy to the military industrialized complex by endorsing the US's wars against the dark peoples of the earth, primarily seen in Graham's support for the Korean and Vietnam Wars abroad and his embrace of law and order rhetoric at home. As a proponent of this Platonic American civil religion offering salvation as belonging to the US national community, Graham, by lying in state and being buried in a casket, which is the byproduct of a society investing in locking up people versus social investment, comes to symbolize the constitutive nature of a theology that demonizes the flesh and embraces imperial logics. Now, taking this one step further, there's another figure who I analyze, whose work I analyze in the paper, who goes by the name of Chuck Colson. Also died in several years ago, 2012. Has been gone for a decade now. But the situation with the evangelical leader Chuck Colson is similar to Graham in many ways. He was once a hatchet man, advisor to President Richard Nixon, sort of think sort of Steve Bannon of yesteryear. And yet had a spiritual conversion during his 7-month federal confinement that led him to establish, upon his release, the organization called Prison Fellowship, which over the years has carried a budget of over $70 million just for the US office and continues to play a major role in political conversations in Washington, D.C. And there is some analysis of recent leadership of Prison Fellowship in the paper and their various practices. But while he was seriously engaged, ultimately Colson's partiality for restorative justice over prison abolition more consistently reflected his theological proclivities, as with Billy Graham, toward individualism, as we'd mentioned before, addressing crime in the lives of individuals in order to work for a restored social order. Colson believed that challenges of inner city America, he believed that they were less structural and institutional than they are behavioral. And yet this was after he had previously displayed a personal history of insensitive attitudes and actions toward the lived experience of Black people he had worked with, believing that the criminal legal system was hard on those without education or money, rather than on those of a minority race. the strange distinction notwithstanding, in the same moment, while acknowledging a moment of his own, in one of his biographical books, a moment of one of his own racist insensitivities to a black man, he had this sort of strange moment where he had acted like a racist, and ventured to then sort of ask of himself upon reflection, how could I be so insensitive, so blind to the obvious? Now, the evidence here is of, at least in this particular text in his book, Sentence, demonstrating an ignorance to his privilege and of both his explicit and ongoingly tacit racism, is something he never seemed to fully reckon with, even during the last few years of his life. And as I say, the paper goes in a bit more detail with this, and particularly Colson's individualism, where he viewed individual improvement in light of crimes committed as coming through individual moral decisions buoyed by state action. He raises the question in later works of science and presumably Darwin as savior, taking that as what he says, nothing less than a vision of redemption and a surrogate salvation, a substitute for the kingdom of God, setting up science as a path to utopia. Where he detects, and he's sort of against this notion of positive eugenics, although doesn't use the term, but detects this lurking Mendelian scientific utopianism with its aim of creating a new and improved race. Now, as a critic of positive eugenics, then, in his discussion of genetics and human aspirational progress, Colson never directly mentions eugenics. And yet critiques with great alacrity the social and genetic engineering possibilities of the day. His perceived attempt to improve or remake human nature genetically through genetic research and genetic engineering and altering, he claims, would, quote, strip people of their dignity and reduce them to commodities. So for Colson, really the issue is about dignity, as well as the fear that both improvement or degeneration, both good or bad, could equally emerge from these efforts advanced by anthropocentric science, showing something of his semi-Augustinian hand in his critique of what's been deemed positive eugenics, and similar to what we've mentioned before. He concludes, the faith that we can save ourselves through science can be sustained only if we shut our eyes to the human capacity for barbarism. Now, ironically, he's the reckoning with the eugenic logic already at work in the modern carceral apparatus and toward the disabled and others. It's never explicitly part of his concern. He chooses instead to disregard the culture's wider negative eugenic logic at work in favor of focus on individual morality that can be improved in no measure through modern scientific optimism, but through what he says a change of heart that comes about through an individual moral choice abetted by the state's punitive social structures as needed. So we go down and look at this eugenic logic that's happening in Colson's rhetoric as he works this in his ministry, which has some significant similarities to what we see, I think, with Donald Trump's self-references to his own good stock. And in one of the reviewers' comments of this paper, revisions forthcoming, the eugenic logic that we identify perhaps more explicitly in Trump, where Trump is seen to have, throughout much of his career and life, referred to his own good stock and his good genes, which has credited him with health and success. And yet some of the policies not too dissimilar from previous presidents, which I'll be revisiting in this paper. But here's really the notion that one's genes can hypothetically withstand. Even with Trump having gotten COVID, he attributed his health and ability to recover from COVID to his genes. He can attack, because of his genes, the pandemic virus, which is, perhaps what the social Darwinists were looking for to take the human race forward. driving it to total success as a result of some providentially bestowed generational endowment that might level the playing field so that all the preferred individuals might make the right moral decisions and thus secure the myth of endless betterment of the human race, right? Never mind the others. Now, in this paper, what I do is go on further, and I'll just sort of briefly mention what the various theological tenets that are active in the history of eugenic thinking. As we've already mentioned, evangelical individualism is a significant one that I account for and offer a critique of throughout the article. But also to note that dispensationalism and supersessionism are also significant features. That is, one group can supersede the other, and history can be divided up in such a way where peoples are detached from those before them, as well as covenant theology and the elect. That is the notion of the chosen, those who are chosen, and of course the opposite being those who are not chosen. And I gave a similar talk to this at Calvin College some months ago, and this kitsch Dutch phrase from the 70s went like this. I mean, if you ain't Dutch, you ain't much. And you think, well, that sounds cute, but then how does, how did your theology inform that, and how does that actually work in life practices? So, but what I do, instead of looking at, after going through the different theological systems, I look to a colleague at Emory University, Kendall Solon, who actually was one of the first people to tell me after I'd completed my PhD at St. Andrews that maybe your work should focus on the prison. And I started to. And, I think Kendall Solon offers us, we could think of this as resourcement, but also I think maybe an attuneness to tradition and to better aspects of various traditions and to wisdom. Now, when the epistemic reframing of knowledge and reality in the present focuses on Jesus of Nazareth, as Solon does in his engagement with what he refers to as new eugenics, it's similar to, I think, Bonhoeffer's emphasis on weakness. And one finds, I think, by looking to Jesus, that Jesus was far more concerned with the weak than with the strong. From his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus' pronounced blessing focuses on the poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek, the merciful, the peacemakers, and the persecuted. And so to this point in Solon's treatment of the so-called new eugenics, with its far more recently effort to affect the core principles, he goes on to summarize the Christian approach to humans in contrast to new eugenics in the following way, where he says that new eugenics, here's what it does: it replaces rather than redeems or heals. It prefers some existing humans to others, instead of affirming the worth and dignity of every human. He goes on to note how new eugenics selects the last to be eliminated rather than the last shall be first, in Jesus' words. And he says that it also screens and counts traits rather than affirming the acceptance of every kind before God, who beholds both what we are in light of who he calls us to be, which Solon deems consistent with the ancient prophetic biblical tradition. Now, this vision, I think, that Solon lays out, I think it really does challenge the dehumanizing tropes that have been brought on by new eugenics, not only in its approach to humans, but also with regard to negative eugenics and also to eugenic philosophy more broadly. Now, I'm going to wrap this up because I think that Solon gives us sort of a helpful takeaway. But if we were to sort of circle back to where we've gone so far in this talk, I think it bears reckoning that eugenic thinking continues to drive actions today. Professing evangelicals, at least from this tradition, and again, I would leave it to other scholars of other traditions to see where it is at work in other religious traditions in particular, as legal scholars are doing their work, showing how this exists in penal policy and so on. There's a lot of work to do on these issues. But for evangelicals, professing evangelicals, it seems to me that they have contributed to this thinking amid wider cultural conditions, which leads them, and by extension, other religious groups, leaders, and followers, into a need to discover normative principles related to their own tradition's enablement of mass incarceration. That particular theological norms and modes of theological reasoning yielded outlooks that reinforce or perhaps help give rise to this mentality can help bring clarity, I think, to the present situation. The matter has additional import for Laura Appelman's proposal, Eugenics Long Tail, teaching not just the complicated eugenics history at all levels of education. One of her articles, she says, we need a commission on ethics and eugenics to analyze how institutions are embodying these eugenic logics and eugenic practices, and that everybody should be taught eugenics history in school, K through 12, and so on, at all levels of education as well, but also incorporating religious rationale, at least I would argue, would be significant. Just seeing religious rationale at work in the history, while also contextualizing relevant historical scientific discoveries. Now, in addition to this, the religious and theological literacy would need, I think, to be a part of this analysis. Now, on the related matter of whether evangelicals today also more widely inherited the pseudoscience, eugenics being a pseudoscience, or else the more powerful cultural and theological logics that had an already established posture toward the science that reinforced prejudicial, that is racial and eugenic, fundamentalist notions already embedded within their theology, I think there's a tentative conclusion that can be reached. If the former, that is, evangelicals inherited this pseudoscience, then theology gave a boost to this eugenic thinking, perhaps without it having been realized, with special significance as eugenic pseudoscience went underground in the post-war period. Right, like we're still doing it, we just don't talk about it in the same ways. My argument makes no necessary judgment about malicious or evil intent, although further research may reveal that what was intended with a lot of 20th century theology was intended to deliberately propagate racist eugenic perspectives on humanity. The commitment to an anti-intellectual fundamentalism that created evangelicals' cognitive dissonance towards science, that enables a greater trust in pseudoscience and conspiracy theories, which in turn enables stronger eugenic logics that are anti-immigrant, anti-disabled, and anti-criminal rather than anti-crime, corresponds precisely, on my reading, with the kind of economic system that requires mass incarceration for its existence. Thank you.